Hi, hello, and welcome to the Lancer Mech tier list. So, our qualifications. We're going to be judging both licenses and frames, namely based off of lore, aesthetic, and there's a bit of bias coming into it. Actual mechanics, like on how good something is or not, there's so many different builds and varieties that it can get wildly different, and when mixing in the alternative frames, it debates, are you counting that as a part of the original license or not? In any case, think of this more as like a lore/design/concept. But from the supplements this is coming from, we have Lancer Wallflower, the Lancer Core Book, obviously, Long Rim, Karrakin Trade Baronies, and because I got a soft spot for some of the alternative frames or some of the licenses, we have Dustgrave and Mountain's Remorse. But with that out of the way, this is more a slight discussion, almost like the small tidbits at the end of some of the license videos or the main manufacturer videos, a little more in depth. And first, not in any particular order, we have the Atlas. So just leaving it there to discuss it for a moment. So the Atlas is a weird one to start with. Don't get me wrong, it's really cool. Like, especially even in the world, in the lore, the way it's currently set up, and the weird mix of Karrakin Trade, Baronies, and Spari. But if you've ever played Metal Gear Rising, this is right in. Specifically that opening scene against the Metal Gear. It's all about, hey, this is basically a really almost skin-tight, armored exosuit, some of the most advanced tech in microfusion. Also with bits of, it's just like the high-end specialized project for the individual fighter in SSC. Less for its own campuses, as that's where the Duskwing falls in, but more the private duelists or attempted heroes within Karrakin space or the hunters of the Spari. A really prized piece, namely because it shows off like, hey, I'm not technically using this big war machine, Barbarossa-esque style to blast away a mountain wall, I'm getting in there with my bare hands and a sword. Which is really stretching the definition of bare hands, because you're still in, like, some of the most advanced exosuits, because that is what this really is. This is so far away from the initial mech or frame or chassis, or even the hard suits that the Caliban still kind of fits into. Especially with the way it's described in some of its equipment and the active core power, it's basically just melding into you and being the second skin. But part of that is what makes it so cool, honestly. Just the fact that it is that second skin advanced human, it's really stretching the definition of mech though. But being a hunter, taking down larger foes, similar in line with the Caliban to an extent. But honestly, I think... Also just tying in for the story of the original chassis and the reason it got out to Spari, even though it was a private Karrakin license, was the fact they lost it in a card game. Oh, I'm gonna have to move faster for these, but I think A. I think it might just sit in A. It'll probably be shuffled around there, maybe lower when we get more mechs into it, but it's really good. Not B. Just because it's stretching the definition of mech chassis. Like, it's really stretching what's a mech. In short, it's cool, but just on the general front of big stomping war machine, it really doesn't fit that category. Nah, it's going back in A. It's cool. It's too cool. And fitting in the design of, I guess, manufacturer as well, how best does it line up with the manufacturer's main promise? And Atlas does. It really does. It's the whole advancement of humankind to an extent, the pushing it beyond the private chassis development, custom made for the specific pilot and not mass produced. It really fits that. It just feels a lot more Karrakin / even more Spari than it does actually SSC. Alright, next one, and this is just because of how everything laid out when I uploaded it, we have Goblin. And, unironically this time, I am putting it in S. Or the hypothetical Goblin tier, but it really does fit that perfect mold of crazy, the license was found in a meta vault, it's all about it's a hacking platform, a guy just basically in an exosuit to a point of just sabotage. It's Goblin in the sense of small, delicate, fragile, but also just screwing you over, being annoying to get rid of, fragile. For some of the same reasons I brought up in the initial April Fool's video for this, I really do think Goblin fits the Horus vibe almost to a T. The only exception that it's not purposely developed by them or necessarily as paracausal as it could be. It really is leaning more into the tech side of it. Actually, now thinking about that, yeah, no, it might move down. I think it's going to move down to A. Just looking later at some of the other chassis we have up here, I think the Goblin license goes to A. Neat lore-wise, neat that it's the one pattern group of Horus that actually has a pattern group that you can tell. Like, oh, that's a Goblin on site. Everything else is a bit more trying to figure out. which also as well kind of stretches it away from Horus. But if you want tech actions, if you want to screw people over with hacking, it's definitely a good option. Also at being a punching bag for videos. Okay, next up we have Duskwing. So Duskwing itself kind of goes into the other angle of SSC that I tried to bring up in my video. Because SSC itself is kind of its own, fighting its own identity to an extent. Because okay, so when it comes to ips-n, in general you have the idea that, oh, blue collar front, but also it's just like bougie, megacorp, monopoly-owning space trading. It's also the angle of piracy that's kept under the shelves. Not under the shelves, but kept off to the side and secreted away so no one really spots it. When it comes to SSC, the other side of it that no one really sees outside of, you know, the front of, hey, we're luxury goods, and then there's also the slightly off to the topic side of the other side projects or their other main focus of, hey, we're looking for genetic manipulation or cybernetics and pushing the human form. There's then the last one that no one really talks about, similar to the piracy with the ips-n. The spying and subterfuge. It's spread across multiple mechs. The Duskwing itself is probably the most, like, in lore-wise, the best example of that within SSC's own licenses that you have access to. Because sure, you have things of like, we're pushing the human form, we're pushing the mech form, it's all luxury goods. But then you have the, hey, most of these things are for invisibility, cloaking, sabotage, skirmishing, getting in and out quickly. I mean, even the flashpoint for SSC is all about breaking in, sneaking through an active war zone or potentially active war zone and boundary garden and kidnapping someone from Onyx Space. The fact that that is the main topic of the initial flashpoint brought up in the core book, it's an element of SSC that's not really highlighted, but comes up a lot. That's a bit of a side tangent on that front, but SSC is also about being sneaky. It's a point that's not brought up too often, but the private security forces within SSC use these as their main chassis to an extent, and again, the whole example brought up in the SSC video of you're flying around, you're being invisible, you're basically being a Dragon Ball fighter in the sky, because that is also just an exosuit. Actually really weird that all three of these are basically just the size half. But flying around, being invisible, and lore-wise, I do have to give it credit as well for all the topics with the Medieval expedition. Which bumps, honestly, with the illusions and the paracausal tech, that bumps it up to S. Even though it's that weird half, but it really fits into SSC, and it's basically human exposed or brought into this higher level, pushing that human form not necessarily within just biotic enhancements, but the fact that, hey, we have this crazy chassis for you, and all this cloaking and illusion and this expedition, breaking the mind. While I would not pick it personally, just that's more based off the characters I'd like to make, the idea of following it within the lore, the chassis, how well it mixes with some of the abilities you get and the different lore blurbs, and the manufacturer itself, it just fits right into S. Next up is Barbarossa. So sadly, Barbarossa isn't gonna be too high up. Like, it's fun, it's loud, obnoxious, and large, but it's honestly one of the failing parts design-wise for me of a few things mechanically as well. Because a lot of its separate abilities within the chassis itself don't necessarily feel Barbarossa. I mean, it kind of does, but it's the fact that you've built this whole chassis around the gun, almost to a detriment of its own design. Like, oh, it's a big weapon chassis of war, but a lot of the general focus and turns within combat, if you are using the main Apocalypse rail, is kind of taking you out of the fight a little bit, or at least limiting your options. You could definitely play it as the massive, multi-large weapon platform, but if you're using that Apocalypse rail, that's gonna... you're playing the Apocalypse rail. Now, if you bring that outside of combat and you go to just the scene, so, you know, activate the core power, getting that guaranteed 100 AP, the blowing apart ships, walls, structures, that I am still all for. The Apocalypse rail in combat just doesn't feel the best. Again, I don't have much experience with it in combat, and not from being the player side either, just the GM, and a lot more white room talk and looking over it for the video, but it's just... Also the general design front of it, not just in the mechanics or what it offers. Like, it has some really useful things in its license, but a lot of them just feel like, oh yeah, this auto drone to help you because you have large guns. Okay, fine, I can get that for the Barbarossa, that feels like it, because it is the large weapons platform. The roller mine? I mean, it kind of fits, but it just feels like, hey, we had a slot missing, what can help the Barbarossa not having it need to move? Still useful and does fit that slot, but it's definitely feeling like, yeah, I'm gonna be standing still in a weapons platform which you didn't need to be humanoid shaped for. Because that's the other part of it, is it looks like a man in a business suit with a briefcase, which is a little funny, and kind of leans into some of the, like, Titan aspect. But if you're going to integrate the weapon, don't just put it on the shoulder. And there's also the argument of that's not actually the Apocalypse Rail, that's the howitzer, or the siege cannon. I get they're going for the image of Harrison the First, which is kind of the humanoid form reason. But it just kind of looks dopey. Like, I think Harrison the First-wise, it would have honestly felt a bit better if it was something closer to the Death's Head, of like a spider tank or walker. Or like those, or more like the StarCraft siege tanks, of the just, yeah, we have a big gun, but we can walk and then set lock in place. With like the siege supports, but it looks like it's actually designed to lock in place instead of 2 legs. I don't know, it just kind of sadly, arts design-wise, falls flat for me and just doesn't feel like it's properly fit the image of Harrison. Which kind of goes for then lore as well of, yeah, it's big, it's bombastic, it's not really fulfilling the role it was initially supposed to, and has so many faults that it's not really the proper image that it was supposed to be initially. Which kind of lines up with the Harrison part, which is why it's still in B, is it's the glorified side project that never really... It's only there because someone pushed for it so heavily under Harrison II. Like, don't get me wrong, with the right situation, and if you were outside of combat, this thing is leveling places. Just design-wise, I felt it could have been... Like, if you were building around the gun, a gun with legs, not a person with a gun on their shoulder. Or if it was just more integrated and not like 2 arms holding a briefcase off to the side, that's way more just me getting pedantic on the design. Though with how much I just talked about the Barbarossa there, just a heads up, I like all these chassis for different reasons, which is why there's no E or F. Like, it can still get down to D, and we'll get there. But like I said, I generally like to try and upbeat all of them, and almost every licensed video is a hype video for it. Like, it's going to be talking about the best aspects of it in the best light. Hence, when discussing the Barbarossa, it was always the annihilating things from the distance, or the ship, or walking over terrain, or through it. Because it can fit those roles, but when you have something so specialized of, I'm a big gun-wielding platform, it can be limited, especially when it has to lock in place. Like, all of these have their own faults for balance reasons to an extent as well, but builds later, other characters and legends and traits, like, you can mix things together so you can buff anything, really, or try to build things different ways. The Barbarossa itself just kind of goes down because it's so centrally around the Apocalypse Rail, it's even less the Barbarossa. But I like them all. I think the Barbarossa has its times it can shine, like, really well, and be that image of Harrison the First, but it just kind of, I don't know, for me, personally, falls flat. Alright, next, to move on before we just keep tacking on the Barbarossa. Black Witch. Why is this mech tied? The whole mech thighs save lives, all that joke. I do honestly like the Black Witch, though. Namely for the different abilities it can do, the idea of... I played Warframe, and Mag was my first Warframe. So just being able to see, like, oh, almost... Not one-to-one, but generally like a magnet-themed, feminine-coded character, like, looks-wise, that works, that fits. I guess character or feminine-coded isn't the... It's a mech. But it's just the word witch thrown into it, and anywho. What I really like within the lore itself is its close ties with the Karrakin trade baronies, though it is an SSC front first. It is not something that was privately built or commissioned by Karrakin trade baronies or built specifically for them. It was something that was SSC property firsthand, trying to compete with the Iskander, I think? Or Iskander? Oh, also, apologies for any pronunciation. I'm gonna have to look up what that one is. But Black Witch-wise, I'm really for it being an A. It fits with the SSC, namely because it was their own, like, technological side of the development. It still fits that human form, because it makes way more sense for SSC to go the human form route than the Barbarossa. And again, these are mechs. There's a whole thing in the lore itself pointing out that, like, hey, isn't it weird that all of these are, like, humanoid forms, and yada yada. But SSC's whole shtick is we're trying to design something to accentuate or modify or based off of, or at least inspired by real life. But honestly, the magnetic walls, the parrying bullets around, the defense of being a bodyguard to a Karrakin noble, it really fits that. Also the idea of, like, arcane magic coding with the whole witch title and the you can't actually see the projectiles or effects, just the manipulation of things. It's really cool. Really cool. I gotta be faster about these. Okay, Zang! Alright. I really like Zang. Namely because it's just so weird, and I really like, oh god, I'm trying to think of what, non-symmetrical frames, as we'll see with another specific non-symmetrical frame. But the idea that this was based off of Nelson, focused around the charging, it was modified by an identified pilot, it mixes in the Mere Smoke Mercenary Company and ips-n, kind of making a deal. There's a lot of lore and fluff built into this one license. Not to mention you can mess around with the terrain by basically chucking things at people with a one big fist. Like, it feels a lot more, at least design-wise, focusing around like, hey, this is a mech chassis based around, it's based off the Nelson, it's a hard hitter, it's charging, and it's got the fist. That I can see, that is visually coded. That is why it kind of beats the Barbarossa in that front of having an integrated system. That's a primary thing, actually, and not just a secondary thing on the shoulder. ips-n-wise, fitting that blue-collar scrap, it was literally built haphazard within wrecks of spaceships. And the idea of working with the Mere Smoke Mercenary Company, trading it, essentially, for a partial take on that license. I like it. It goes an A. It fits with that scrap-together charm. Next up, Death's Head. Honestly, I think the Death's Head just kind of fits there. Like, lore-wise, it's neat, but outside of the fact that, hey, it's a military line, it's also hired out and used by a lot of Union forces, and it's just a railgun sniper. I say just, it has other systems as well, but it's namely, that's its role. It doesn't have anything tied to, hey, we're really trying to push the boundaries of the human form, or like this is a super luxury thing, or tied into our sneakiness. It can hang onto walls, it can shoot a big railgun. It's a spider mech, which is a nice thing to it. That's a bit of a different design. But really, it's a sniper. It's just a standard sniper artillery piece spider mech, and that just kind of fits in B based off the theming and lore around it. There's nothing too particularly special about some of the things that are mentioned in it. God, I feel bad talking bad about any of these. Oh, next one. And the reason the Goblin got pushed to A instead of S. The Pegasus. This thing leans hard into the, yeah, we're scrapping together code and things that are just not of this material realm or this reality. With Gun, the Ushapti on its back, the Mimic Gun, the autocannon, it's all there. It's so much of it there is there. It's just weird. Like, it's like, oh yeah, instead of having legs or it standing bipedal, it's, no, it's quadrupedal. And then it also has hands for all of its limbs. It looks almost organic, and like you broke open its back to reveal its innards to form its spine. Guns just forming out of the side of it as it's adapting on the fly, the equivalent of a paradox sitting on its back. This being dealt out as a mysterious weapon, messing with code and things beyond comprehension, it fits Horus. Because it still falls into that development angle, some of the hacking side of it, the manipulation, especially with the Sisyphus NHP. Like, mechanics-wise, it really fills in the blank of, yeah, you're messing with weird Horus stuff. And that is definitely some of the weirder end of Horus things. That's fallen into S, just both in design and some of its components and what it has in lore. Good old Sisyphus. Next one is the Drake, and the Drake, I think, falls into B. Lore-wise, especially with the video coming up, I've already got my own fun things on that, but it's kind of just standard big bulky tank, strap a machine gun to it, a heavy weapons guy. There's a bit more tied to it, but it really is kind of that. The weird thing is its contradiction in its description. Like, oh god, there was another mechs from anime someone brought up that this basically almost looked like one-to-one. Not quite, but definitely looks like an inspiration. But in a lot of its lore tab as being the first thing that ips-n made, the Blackbeard almost looks more like that. The Blackbeard looks a lot more specifically like industrial components almost strapped together, which is namely because of its stripped down frame. But the Drake itself looks a lot more like, this looks like something Harrison would make if they had a lot more of like a smooth or rounded out frame. But hey, if you're trying to emulate someone, why not emulate the other war front? That was the other angle of it, of trying to tie it back to like World War I aesthetic and era of like, again, the whole battlefield guy in armor with a machine gun or bunker. This is way less, it even calls out like, oh yeah, back in a time where numbers were the name of the game. It's the antithesis of numbers. It's the whole shtick is, it is one big tanky lad with a machine gun that can kill lots of things fast. So for a number of those reasons of it, begins to lack those internal components, it falls into B. Next is the Iskander. Iskander? Oh boy. I don't know how to feel about this one. Just because it's funny, it's goofy, it's the explosions, the demolition cyclops, but it also has this tinge of gravity manipulation, which can be seen during its art piece of some of the other things floating around it. But it really just kind of feels like a weird mix of, yeah, this is a demolition character mixed with gravity manipulation. The two themes do work together, namely, not thematically, but they work mechanically together of, I place down a mine or explosive, and I throw you into it, or the mine into you. It's all about rapid dispersal, manipulating where everyone's going to be standing alongside the explosives. But it just felt like these were like two characters initially, not that they were supposed to be together. Which fair to have like different things mixed up within your license itself to like, oh yeah, we have explosions and then some things on the side, or gravity manipulation and then some explosions along the side. But its core chassis is a mix of explosive and gravity-based traits. Namely explosive, but No, actually, just double checking, a lot of its traits are centered around just the explosive front of it. Arguably the latter part of the chassis of just setting the air to be explosive. Exaggeration, but also its lore tab isn't that long. Like, it's not thematically built into things, it doesn't have stuff going on the back of it, it's just a, hey, this is a specialized explosive chassis built by Harrison Armory for the front lines. That's about it. It uses some experimental tech, it's what namely the Black Witch was made to kind of counteract or to compete with. But I think it kind of fits in B, because it's just... No, honestly C. Just lore blurb-wise, it doesn't have anything really going for it thematically. Like, everything else here... No, it goes back in B. Just because Swallowtails or Death's Head is also there. Saladin! Saladin goes up a good chunk. It is protective, it is the shielding arm, it is also tied to Harrison I's own personal chassis. Fear killer. Like, it's got a good amount going for it, and is also just always something you'd like to see on the battlefield, either in-world or as a player, if it's on your side, that is. But as someone that's supposed to have shield projections and these different systems to actually be able to like cover up, protect someone, a generator, it has it on its back, it has the different projectors on one of its arms, and even some of the weird like padding and coating on its side looking like a sash or cloak. That whole thing of, hey, its integrated systems are a good, like, decent, prominent feature on it, and a bit more central to its general design, but also the fact it looks just tanky, which it is. Which is why the Barbarossa keeps going, it's in C. But no, the Saladin A, I'm not bringing it to S, because I think falling into Harrison Armory lines a bit, it kind of falls short. It definitely feels a lot more like, hey, this is a Union humanitarian resources, or not humanitarian, DOJ angle. Similar to the Swallowtail, if that's actually more notably used by SSC forces, or Union forces, same thing with the Saladin. It's more notably in that element of Union instead of Harrison Armory. So it kind of sits in A, but comfortably, really comfortably in A. Raleigh? I think was how you were supposed to pronounce this? Oh boy. Ah man, the unfinished, the unwanted, the failure of a license. It is the cult, within lore, it is the cult classic of licenses, at least amongst ips-n. It was their other attempt of making a new frontline, close combat, skirmishing attempt of Warfront after following up the Drake or the Blackbeard. And then just never saw much frontline use, because it was way too specifically like specialized, it didn't fit a mass production frontline-esque scenario. But it was later on when specific people ended up finding it, or other specific lancers or pilots were like, hey, I like this. This is good, this fits that close combat duelist role I was looking for. And kind of also aesthetically fits into, well, I mean, it's the cowboy. We already talked about this. It's Wild Wild West, it's a gunslinger. It's got a revolver for a mech. On top of that, a hammer, its other guns on its back, the gun in its chest. Like, I've stepped away from some of the lore side of it to an extent, but it fits the role of the desperado. Even some of the other art pieces within the core book as well reflect this with its other pilot shown next to it. It is the desperado, the lone gunslinger, the fighter, close quarters combat with a hammer and a revolver, and a gun in its chest, because that that just fits the industrial, like, yeah, why not strap it in there? Like, we don't need it on a shoulder mount or something, we're gonna integrate that directly into it. And mechanically, it can also fit that role of the gunslinger, of the quick firing, the fighting. It just fits. Honest, it doesn't fit the core thing of... That's gotta go to S, because it just fits that front of the blue collar in the sense of not being used industrially, like the Lancaster to an extent. It's more the fact that this was almost something discarded by the monopoly. It's not something specifically owned by it or factory. It's a bit like rough and tumble, left up to the individual to actually use and manipulate. It's not super specialized like SSC, though it kind of is. It's also just fun. Who doesn't like a cowboy? Yeah. I'm keeping it an S. Keeping it an S. The Sunzi. I might also be mispronouncing. Apologies. Sunzi? Sunzi? I would put it down in C alongside Barbarossa, because, like, hey, One, it goes into B for two reasons, compared to the Barbarossa. It's lore, which has a lot of really fun ties, because it's the only access into some more Valedores. Because the whole shtick is, which also would drag it away from Harrison Armory specifically, because, like, it's basically a Valedores mech or chassis, just under the guise of a Harrison Armory license. Because that's where most of the tech is actually based off of. To the point that they just put, like, one of their blink drives as its head for the chassis. It's like, we can't really fit this within the torso itself, because that's where the cockpit's going. We can't, like, replace some of the arms for it, maybe. We'll just put it on the head. We'll just put it right there. It's real vibes of those different goofy moments of just strapping a massive jet engine on top of something. But partly for that goofy factor and unique angle of it, but the fact you get the Harrison Armory Valedores trade, and that lore fleshed out both like, oh shoot, they've actually made contact, worked with, but things have been translated in this different view you get from their perspective, or at least translated perspective. Not to mention what it can do in combat. This whole thing shtick is being able to just run, like, rip holes in space-time the entire way. Not necessarily time, but just portal here, portal there, teleport someone over at that angle of it. Like, it's just moving people around the battlefield itself. Which, I really like its lore, but fitting Harrison Armory-wise and the military aesthetic outside of the, hey, it's experimental tech, I do think it falls back into C as more of that, like, hey, it's a specialized project, and it doesn't feel Harrison. Like, sure, its look is a little bit blocky to an extent, but it almost feels like you could just make this a Valedore chassis if they had their own license or manufacturing. Just because of the whole themes about what it does and how it's doing and the different lore blurbs tied to it. It is basically not a Harrison Armory mech. It's disguised as one. I still really like it. I think it's cool, both mechanically and its themes and lore and what it shows us, but I just think one of the things we're judging here is how well it best fits ips-n, which is why this up here is a bit tenuous. Or licenses in the manufacturing. And it just doesn't fit Harrison 100%. It's, yeah. Next up, we have the Kid. Kid I like. Really like the Kid. It's funky, namely just because mechanically it's like, yeah, you have a crew, you have different bits of, like, drones acting out as these different simulacrums that can be able to work and function as a crew for your ship. I mean, heck, even the pilot in that is wearing a pirate hat. Also the fact that supposedly it's tied to some, like, private miner's lost stash and treasure and these defensive codes it had for its satellite, which they could never actually separate from the license itself. No one actually can figure out how to get into it. Like, literally within the license itself, not even just tied separately to a story or origin. The license itself is tied into the fact that there is this mystery around where is this treasure buried? Where is this secret hold of different defense contracts and different abilities tied to that different satellite in the Jolly Roger? Oh yeah, orbital satellite as well. It's basically calling it down. But it fits so many bills for ips-n and the general theming of pirate. Of, hey, yes, the giant orbital satellites, Jolly Roger, you could basically broadside to an extent, fire it down, telescope almost, or big, it almost looks like a big cannon on the front. It's that Walker chassis, so it looks less like a person or a person acting like a pirate, like the Blackbeard. It looks more like, yeah, you have a ship and a crew that's walking on land with all the different human-like drones around you. It's tied to a miner, it's been bought out by the company, there's a secret, like, it's less the, I'm breaking onto a ship and scaring people, and it's more, I am role-playing as a pirate hunting secret treasure tied to this old legend of a miner out in space. It just fits so well, because it's the pirate angle of ips-n from a different perspective of it, if like, yeah, we're just aesthetically going with the themes of pirates in the story. Like, lost treasure somewhere. But also still being able to rip apart a ship or a station, because you have an orbital satellite you can threaten people with. The whole idea of a pirate ship threatening a broadside. Because like, oh, it looks unassuming from the front. It's a small 4-legged chassis. It's got some dainty, like, human-esque mechs, nothing with guns on it. And then it's like, oh no, that secretly has a really high damaging, high range thing that you can't see immediately on it. The whole thing of like hiding the cannons on a pirate ship or being fast and quick and then revealing what you can shoot. It just fits that idea and theme so well alongside the rest of the company and it being just bought out and already from an industrial origin. Apologies for how long this is taking. I'm realizing how long this is going to be. I'll try to be faster. I do ramble on these. Morning Cloak. A. Because it goes more into the the general weeb-esque angle of some of the things in SSC, but also the biological enhancements pushing the front line, the specific delicate but deadly Omira motion Diru. But also leaning into the angle of the genetic experimentation and manipulation of like, oh yeah, there's body parts of Onic people used as components in that. And the whole, like, super delicate micro thread of metal that's held magnetically in place from its blade. You can't actually see the blade itself, that's just the holster for it. And it's all that ridiculousness. It's so over the top, so extreme, so specifically designed. It's just the angle of it doesn't seem like luxury or necessarily the stealth. We're moving into it. It's the extreme end of things, experimentation, pushing the human form, both the pilot and what it's made out of, human form-esque. That delicate, extreme danger and death. Yeah, that fits. The Nelson is probably going to go in B. For some of the similar reasons to the Death's Head and to the Drake, sure, it's a bit industrial. The big thing lore-wise is it being used by the Albatross. That's really good, and the Knight aesthetic to an extent, but when it fits the general themes of ips-n and lore side of it, like, don't get me wrong, Nelson's great. Charging around, blasting people with a javelin, explosive tips, but it doesn't really feel like blue-collar-esque or industrial. Outside of, like, being chunky in certain components or areas. But Albatross is great, Lance is great, its general actions are really good license-wise, but fitting into the ips-n general shtick. Is it pirate? No, not really. Is it fleet? I mean, the Albatross are, but it itself isn't. It's not, like, naval-themed-esque. Is it industrial? Not really, outside of some blocky components. It looks actually more suitable to be something closer to one of the KTB things from SSC. So it just kind of falls into B. Like, it's still really good. It's just following along this, like, lore and theming side of things. It kind of falls back. Still a bit closer because it closer relations with the Albatross and ips-n, which is why the Sunzi and it aren't in the same row. But moving on to the Hydra! So, like playing a Conjurer or Necromancer and other tabletop RPGs or general fantasy shticks, or any kind of summoner using drones, or, I mean, hello, I'm a single player that's basically a GM now who's running multiple characters or things on the board. I enjoy some of its lore tied to it being a potential precursor to the Bay lore, some of the earlier model patterns from Horus, and the fact it also feels, it's not as much as Paracausal-esque, even though it does have an NHP on board integrated into it. It's definitely an A. It doesn't reach the Pegasus level of things, but the whole thing of like heisting an NHP from it, some of the origins around that, potential precursor to the Bay lore, it's just drone swarms, and while it's technically like a humanoid form, it's not really, it's drones in a trench coat faking a humanoid form. But also just if you want to be again, playing into the hacker angle of it, or the computer whiz of like, I'm running multiple drones at the same time. Inside this cockpit, this is a control bay. Also within this tier list, a slight apologies on the Horus one of the unsuspecting pilots being cut in half. That's wrong. It could happen. It's still within the realm of possibility for that license of things Horus does and how it's integrated, but within the actual description, it's like, oh, they're unprepared for seeing it come apart, namely in the sense of fighting one, not in being in one. Like, you thought you chopped a mech's arm off, but then the arm itself just comes to strangle you again. Sort of shtick, but I don't know. It's still within the possibility of the mech, which is another reason I like it, is another angle of these. What they leave open for interpretation or things for you to do, like, yeah, you can still do the War Machine, you can do different builds with it. The Sunzi, you can lean way more into Harrison Armory's specific components and equipment. Like, you can expand on these or interpret them in different ways, which is where the Goblin kind of falls out of S, is because it's this. that's what the Goblin looks like, and that's what the Goblin usually does as a weapons platform. It's more a hacking platform. It namely goes for more a horse thing on like what they could potentially look like. SSC also kind of gets that pass because it's a lot more specialized or built specifically for a specific patron or private use, whereas ips-n and Harrison Armory are a lot more standardized. Speaking of the Baylor S tier. Even though it doesn't have an NHP specifically integrated into it, the idea that its original attack came from one, the one that's tied to the Hydra, follows in that gray goo, gray swarm, gray wash, whatever you want to call it specifically, access to it. It's a terrifying thing, and alongside the Horus and the other tech that it can propose and use, it plays into the fact that even though you have this one specific art piece, the way it's described and in the lore itself, it can fit so many different things. It can be that mindless swarm that other people have. It can be a single nanite that begins to spread and convert a previous other chassis. It could also just be that it's printed, and the code itself infected and just swap things for nanites instead. There are so many things you can do with, hey, this is nanites the mech. Not to mention the actual, even though it's not necessarily paracausal, the actual horrifying nature of greywash, or controlled nanite swarms. Of this is eating something apart. Like just tearing it, just piece by piece away. The whole thing of a blender against a mortal person. Or just shredding apart a mech or chassis, or getting into the biological components on the inside. And the whole idea of its grapple angle of, yeah, you're getting close so you can mesh or just meld or open up into this swarm. The general horror element of it and its design of, the initial art piece design of it being look like that demonic Baylor-esque figure, the flames-esque from the different clouds of nanites leaving its central chassis, and the, like, I always saw the helmet as, well, a cyclopean helmet, but some other people mentioned that it looked like an ant or insectoid. And what I really like is both of those could work. It could be that almost cyclopean warrior, dead set on you, single target glowing eye, or it's a hive mind and that's the queen's head or something like that. In any case, there are so many different possibilities you can run with the Baylor itself. The design leaves some of those open. It is that intimidating, large figure. It's so good. in tech gone wrong. The metal mark itself actually goes up to A, maybe S? Nah, it's gonna go up to S if, like, the Duskwing's getting up there. Because that metal mark itself, because someone brought it up specifically less like a skirmish and more like a commando. Looking closer at some of its stats later on, which is another thing to say as well as this list would probably drastically change after going through every license. But similar to the Duskwing, it has the cloaking, it has the subterfuge angle of it, it has its own private SSC use specifically, though it is still used amongst some of the other general forces or private licenses for defense contracting. But it's like, hey, we took the railgun from the Death's Head and we just downsized it into something you can manually hold. We gave you knives for close quarters combat. We gave you skirmishing invisibility. Gave you the ability to hide in plain sight and then fire to get your shot off. It's upsized from the Duskwing being able to just zip around invisibly to hit someone, but it fits a lot more that commando mech. Not to mention the advanced human form, the equine features specifically called out with the weird, like, double bent legs and hooves. And the blank face on the front of it. It really fits that vibe of elite commando. Scary figure. Lancaster. S. Who doesn't like a good Lancaster? Who doesn't like healing? Who doesn't like the industrial blue-collar-esque vibe and the general... This thing was an operations utility mech that specifically has made a combat variant, which is the license you get. There is a non-combat version of it. Everything else... ips-n-wise was usually like that you can play as a Lancer was like, yeah, this was designed combat mentality first of, especially the ones we've covered so far, but just generally of like, yeah, we brought a general like four-legged trucker, or not, we got a four-legger instead of an 18-wheeler out onto the combat. All about repairs, transporting people, being a mobile repair bay and equipment storage bay. It really does fit that vibe of, yeah, we brought a truck to the battlefield and a repair bay. And even the gut pilot on top of it, just having something in their hand, a drink of some kind, just toasting to you. It just fits it too well. It fits ips-n way too well. And just as a good vibe of that, if you want to play a trucker, the industrial blue collar angle of it. In the general lore, even though lore tab doesn't have too much, just the idea that it was described previously as, hey, this was utility, retrofitted for a battlefield role in theater. Just because it left the precedent of there's a lot of things like the Lancaster actively going around ips-n in their ships and as a general civilian model. It essentially left truckers as riding Lancasters, and that's what I really like about it. But no, Lancaster's good, great license, fun time. The idea that they just, like, yeah, we need it to be able to be on the war front. Alright. Tortuga! Big shotgun, deck sweeper, kill and clean. It is the, I like to think of it as the uncle or grandfather of the Caliban. Its whole shtick to also get into ships or board them, and to block hallways, act as cover for people like following behind them in large corridors or following the main spinal mount of a ship. And again, the shotguns do just clear everything in front of it, and demolitions experts, and it's... The Tortuga is intense. Honestly, yeah. Nah, if the relay's up there, the relay, oh boy. Tortuga's going to S. As well, just for the big, bulky, industrial map. Like, this is what a bulky industrial war chassis from ips-n would look like, not the Drake. This is what it would look like, and it fits the role of its description a lot better than like, hey, doesn't this look like an infantryman from World War I? Even though its whole shtick is it's a massive tank. This is like, yeah, we're just a chunky lad that's going to fill this entire hallway. Oh, the Sherman. I mean, similar, we're gonna go a lot faster with these. S. It is the front line, the standardized chassis for Harrison Armory, its whole shtick of high-tech energy, blasting things away alongside Sherman as well. Yes, it has an integrated weapon, and its whole shtick is part of its integrated weapon. It fills that role a lot better than the integrated weapon of the Barbarossa. And yes, it's in the head, but that's... The idea of a laser eye is also just a great scheme to an extent, but you can also see it's built out into the back with the heat vents flaring off. Over-the-shoulder laser gun and so many different variants of burn and energy damage. And enhancing those things in its own license and being... It really feels a lot more, hey, this is Harrison Armory. Like, just seen in one big chassis compared to the Barbarossa. The Barbarossa feels a lot more like this is a pet project of just some of the gall and pride of the armory. This feels a lot more like this is a grand example of the Harrison Armory, as both a faction, as both some of the lore tied to it, of it being the standardized chassis and mech and its tech and equipment. It's good, it's solid, it's S. Gorgon! Weird. Going back up to A for Horus. I'm a big sucker for Horus, just in the different thing. Yeah. Just because it's so many questions of what the hell is it doing? It's that weird, spindly, Annalesque vibe. It actually, you can see some relation between it and the Goblin just in how its limbs are kind of shown, or where the Pegasus would eventually go. But the idea of its stare that can affect and give brain hemorrhaging to both biological targets and mess with electrical targets at the same time, and still be entirely unaffecting allies, that strange paracausalness to it, and the angle of, we have a very aggressive, not necessarily guard dog, but very defensive NHP on board. This whole shtick is, I'm gonna punish you with all my reactions. Namely in that aspect of it, it's almost a protective figure instead of a super defensive one. Of, I'm freezing and paralyzing you, not necessarily to just trap you here like the Minotaur would do. It's here because it's trying to protect its allies next to it and itself. The idea that has almost a personality both in how it functions, is designed, and then the NHP itself having said personality. But hacking... Where I'm really struggling with it is, sure, it's a bit paracausal, but it doesn't really feel too much into the tech angle gone wrong. I mean, some of it with the stunning to an extent. Lore aspect-wise, you have a lot more with the Baylor and the Hydra and the Pegasus as well. Gorgon's probably going to fall to B. It's really good, really fun, but it just... Yeah. Alright, Tokugawa. Doesn't feel HA. I mean, it kind of does, but almost everything Harrison Armory is firearms based. Almost all of them. even if it's something a bit close quarters like a flamethrower to an extent, almost all of them are still sensible, and we're shooting from a distance instead of the close quarters plasma blades. The idea it's an officer weapon position, yet it's almost a hot shot into the danger zone. Like, it doesn't make sense officers would be using it too much. I mean, it kind of does, though Napoleon makes a lot more sense and also lore-wise fills a similar role. And another, like, it just... Like, it... D for the Tokugawa. It feels a lot more like a Horus contraption, in the sense that, hey, this is... It feels similar to the Kobold in how it's initially described in the lore. Kobold-wise, that is. We'll get to that, but... It's dangerous, it's impromptu, it's got some components that are strapped together and have dangerous downsides. It's close quarters, it's breaking its reactor to an extent to get this product out of it. It doesn't necessarily feel Harrison Armory. Like, if Harrison Armory is the, like, unified military front, destruction, experimental tech to an extent, this just feels way too haphazard for Harrison. And yes, there's some haphazard stuff in some of these other licenses, but just... It feels a lot more like we strap drones to everything, or we're using these crazy nanites for something that could go horrifically wrong. And again, a lot closer to the Kobold, weirdly. I think D. Like, I like it. It's just, HA-wise, it doesn't feel like the officer role it's trying to give off. Ooh, man. Feels bad. Feels bad putting any of these below, like, B. Because I do like them still, and mechanically I do still like them, and they just... might have a specifically more particular niche, but Speaking of those, Manticore, A. S. Manticore's going, it's gotta go in S, it's Castigate. Castigate enemies of the Godhead. It's a lot more into leaning into the shtick of the weird eldritch side of, not just like, oh, yeah, Pegasus is weird, paracausal, and even looks this weird biological angle of it. The Manticore is the haphazard angle of the Tokugawa, but it makes sense for Horus. This thing is actively destroying itself, and sometimes doing it specifically in one action, or close to it. The fact it needs a pilot inside to detonate. It's like, yeah, you're not detonating this separately, and you're not consistently threatening it, though you are threatening it with overheat and reactor damage and stress. And all its weapons both damaging you and other people. And the tech side of it looks like a lot of tech that has just been strapped together, dangerous to both itself and onto this mech specifically, because they know its whole shtick is it blows up. The pilot's not surviving this, so why does it matter if the weapons are dangerous to itself and the people around it? It just feels a lot more into the Horus angle of like that, and specifically a lot more like occultic, eldritch side of Horus. Because if Goblin and Baylor lean in more into the dangerous tech side, and Pegasus a bit more the weird paracausal side, Manticore is the marriage between those two. And the whole meme of Castigate, it's good. Alright, Swallowtail, A. Kind of. Maybe B? Maybe... B, because I know where another's going. So, Swallowtail itself also plays into the cloaking aspect and some of the hiding and subterfuge, but is a lot more the skirmish, mark a target, pin someone down, aid a sniper trying to already hit it. It buddies up. Like, it's still decent and fulfills that role, but generally filling into the SSC side of things and any general, like, big lore blurb about the Swallowtail, there's not much. Because, again, it falls into the Death's Head role of it sure is doing its job. It was built for a job. And it's doing it. It was meant to cloak, it's meant to skirmish, it's meant to look out, it's meant to aid frontline rank and file troops. It's got some high-tech equipment on it, but it's not themed around the, like, progressing a specific human or integrating into them, and both mentally and physically. It's also not necessarily humanoid. Sure, they don't necessarily have to be just given different, like, hooves and multiple limbs, but it just feels like a cloaking skirmish tank or APC. Again, good. Fits that role well. If we're talking about any specific unique lore tied to it, or its necessarily role in fitting the SSC core ideas, cloaking a bit. Used by the Constellar Forces, but same way it's just used by forces. Okay, next up, Constellar Forces specifically. And okay, next up, Vlad. So, Vlad I'm upset with. Not necessarily for the chassis itself, but for the naming scheme. Namely because Vlad doesn't really fit into any of the general naval aesthetics, or naming scheme-wise, and it upsets me because someone brought up that it was supposed to be originally named after Admiral Yi. Which fits so well! It would fit, it's a slam dunk of another person known for spikes to an extent, and really hurting their enemies. But outside of that point, this feels a lot more of the, again, scrapped together, specifically used industrial equipment, again by miners, but some rebels here and there, and then co-opted by ips-n as a larger branch. I mean, a nail gun is one of the main things it uses, and then other mining equipment. To the point that it, again, leans into the piracy, haphazard, blue-collar, something out in industrial space, equipment. Trying to be very fast now, that falls into S. Could you tell that I definitely like most of these? Alright, Minotaur! I like it. Mostly. What's the space between? It's messing with, like, are you here or are you not? Metafold maze. And again, the name of Minotaur scheming and the general design of the horns to an extent, and bigger on the inside. Really messing with space in relation to things. Perception of said things. Also some of the goofy components that, like, yeah, if the chassis is entirely blown up or annihilated, the pilot is completely fine, because you're not technically in it. Which makes me wonder of, like, what on the inside could the cockpit look like? Because it could be anything. Really could. I think it's less the hacking side of it. It still does have some of that, but it's a lot more into the, like, paracausal angle of it and the other first identified pattern group outside of the Goblin, where there suddenly began to be divergence in what the Horus patterns began to look like. So you have that angle of it, you have the weird paracausal angle, and some of the different, again, weird text you can find on CompCon. It's good. Hey. Monarch! Looks like a race car, Ferrari, being honest, just namely with the fins up in the back and on the shoulders. But missile, as you know. And a lot of its general, I would honestly put it lower, say it's a Harrison Armory, if it wasn't for what you can specifically do with said missiles, and what all of the lore tabs tied to it are talking about. It is a well-designed private model handed out to a few people, purposely held back to, like, raise its price and demand. Artificial scarcity and all that, so that fits into SSE's blanket of that luxury good for what it looks like. That weird rough humanoid form also fits that. Nothing really manipulating using biological components or angling into that side of things. However, its whole shtick of, it is the finest design, most tempered. It describes it as delicate and accurate. Not the chassis itself, though, is where most of it is seen. Because it's a big, bulky, size 2, almost race car-esque, which plays into the, like, high-end sort of thing and private scarcity. Artificial scarcity and high prices. But it's the fact that missiles have all seeking there, it's all about lock-on, it's all about the missiles being the delicate, precise thing. Make sure it's not the Barbarossa, I'm gonna go bombard or just send flak everywhere and send mines rolling to someone. No. The Monarch, surprisingly, while being explosives all the time, is all about precision strikes, which leads into the delicate, fine-touch, precise nature of a lot of SSC's constructs, and I think that just falls well into A. Blackbeard, S. I mean, from the Blackbeard video, not much has changed outside of that, but it is the brutal industrial problem. We have a problem with pirates, let's make some extermination. We also are pirates, why not have one for ourselves? It's good for both roles, killing and pirating. The whole idea of it's been purposely slimmed down so all you can see is really the, like, base components and some minimal armor, and it looks the part. You can have open reactors on the backs, ventilation, all instead of it being bulky in different parts like the Drake or the Tortuga, it is literally just this spindly, blocky frame. Like, okay, there's a knee, there's a leg, nothing bulky or armor plating or weird padding, just the reactor up top. Different tubes hanging out the side because it couldn't be, like, strapped down or hidden under any plating. Winch system for getting around in 0G, it leans into the industrial aspect while not necessarily being that blue-collar tools. Though the chain axe ironically does kind of fall into that, or not ironically, but weirdly falls into that, of, yeah, it's brutal slaughter, it's really scary, it's all about shredding, but it also has a practical purpose of getting through bulkheads. Just solid slam dunk S, really. Napoleon! See, because it lands a bit more into the Sunsea angle of a bit more like, hey, this is a pet project,
big experimentation, it's less that front line, but also mentions defense and our officers as well. Like, if you're going to talk about something that's going to protect the pseudo-nobility of officers and higher ranks within Harrison Armory, it's the Napoleon. It's not the Tokugawa. The Tokugawa is going to get them killed. This is for a blitz frontline action of some troop that's going to die anyway, or like a hotshot Lancer, the equivalent of Top Gun. And the Napoleon is the officer trying to be protected, which it's even the name, Napoleon. Sure, partly the joke because it's small, but then it also limits into the experimental tech. The only downside is it's not really offensive. Like, sure, it has the displacer, which is terrifying, but it only has one mount and only gets that one weapon later on. Outside of that, it's all about protecting itself, being armored, and... Hell, I honestly B, because it kind of falls in line with the Iskander of, like, it's experimental tech, it's weird paracausal tech, but also still has a general role it's supposed to fill of explosive demolitions, of protecting an officer, being a tank, essentially, but less in purposely drawing fire and just being immune to it. Or shielding from some other things. Also, I really like the concept of how it talks about blink space and some of the weapons and designs, and oh, the tab for the displacer itself. So good. Genghis! I mean, it's a similar reason to the Sherman, but it falls into the other angle of HA, but it's still the industrial, can be on the front line, meant for dealing and killing things and destroying them, but also the slash and burn, scorched earth, quite literally angle of things. It's S. It's industrial, it's brutal, it's tactical in the sense of, yeah, we need to get rid of mass people, biological targets. Okay, bring out the Genghis. If this is fear killer, this is fear maker. Alright, now the Emperor. Oh man. Sadly, I think C. Like, okay. It's one of the KTB ones, so it's a lot more themed around Karrakin trade baronies to an extent, but there is already another one themed like that, at least closer to it. Sure, it fits the role of, like, yeah, it looks like an ancient archer. The bow's super cool. The general abilities of, hey, this thing's messing with paracausal stuff, and that's it. It is a delicate thing outside of that. But it is similar almost to the Barbarossa. It's more just a general design thing of, it doesn't look like a chassis or many metallic components. Like, at least the Black Witch, you can tell, like, okay, the legs are metal, the arms are metal, the general torso or shoulders up, at least, are metal, same with the head. This looks like just someone underneath that, wearing, like, a layering of cloth underneath, and then just fancy tipped boots. It doesn't look like a mech, in short. It just looks like a big guy. Like a cloud giant could be wearing this, fantasy-wise. Which, yes, bipedal mechs, sure, but it goes a little too far into just looking like a guy. Like, you can shake it up. Even the Barbarossa does the guy but mech a bit better than the Emperor. Alright, Caliban! You have a problem. You need to take out a crew, and not the ship. Bring out the Caliban. It is the very scary grandson of the Tortuga, or son, or whatever. Because it's shotgun, border, bulky. Instead of being super large to block the hallways, this thing is sprinting through small decks and bulkheads. This is getting to the people, the soft underbelly and innards of a ship. If an entire, like, carrier is a crab with a shell to an extent, the Tortuga's breaking in and blocking the hole and just gutting things that's passing through, the Caliban is getting through a small hole on the inside, and there is no meat left inside the shell. Not to mention this thing can go toe-to-toe with larger creations just because it's just a kill. It's Doomguy the mech. It has a whole shtick of, yeah, when you reload the shotgun with a certain upgrade, the shells can eject violently to the point of being able to do damage to mechs. Or entirely decapitate normal people. And the fact its lore is tied to, it does the industrial look, it's all about boarding and a bit of that piracy angle of it. And the fact that it was a boardroom problem of, hey, we have this issue similar to the Blackbeard, of like, hey, we had an issue with pirates, we have an issue with crew being alive, and long boarding processes. Well, we made a mech just to kill people. Oh god, one-man army. Even if, like, stats-wise or license-wise, it doesn't always play out that way, the idea that it was specifically built for that angle of it, and it's such a fun lore tab and so over the top in its descriptions. Next up, Lich. Which I would put in A, because, you know, it follows the humanoid form, but just, it just creaks over into S for Horus as well. Because it falls less into, like, yeah, we're experimenting with strange tech. Maybe. But you brought time travel into this mix. This is going to get hectic. But it looks a lot more fantasy than anything else. It looks like that decaying corpse or, well, a lich. The weird cloak off to the side, it looks a less mechanical or the weird biological angle of it. But that strange husk, and a lot of the heavy lifting is for some of its strange abilities and its warping of reality, time and space, and causality. But the lore tabs for it, the description tied to the frame itself, and some of the different components in the chassis and its descriptions for just unweaving someone. It's more going into the Eldritch side even a step further than the Ushabti and the Manticore to an extent. It's just so terrifying. Drink deep and descend, my friends. Kobold, solid A. Horus, as in it's a bit more that, it's almost that leaning a bit industrial-esque ips-n-wise. Actually, it falls into that angle of, similar to the Albatross one with the Nelson, it's a lot more known for being related to the rebels within Karrakin space, and the Ungratefuls. Hence the whole fusion rifle being the thing that's on their flag is related to the Kobold. But in its early descriptions of its lore, you get to hear its development on how it's gotten to this stage. It didn't always look like this. Even when Horus got their hands on it, it's been developed into this. But was previously just an industrial chassis jury-rigged with certain coding and printing and just instructions given to pilots to be able to warp it into something a lot more offensive. And always described as dangerous, breaking into a reactor and using things that could be able to burn things away and dangerous to the pilot itself. Essentially, the early Kobold, in its own description, is what the Tokugawa is virtually now. It's the reason Tokugawa is so down there, but the Kobold, B, a lot more associated with the KTB, a lot more industrial-esque, because it's all about slag, manipulation, terraforming to an extent, less paracausal. It still has some of that with hacking to an extent, but it's a lot more core based around use by another group or not quite nailing the niche the manufacturer's in. Still good with some of the lore tabs tied to it. Hence why it might have been an A, but B. White Witch. Okay. So White Witch, A. Just cool factor for one, but the aspect of it feels like a natural development of the Black Witch. Okay, instead of using magnets to like repel larger projectiles, why don't we try to control the small molecules of metal around us to make our armor and equipment? Also leaning into the KTB of being this private thing that's bought out and used. That weird alien-esque factor pushing beyond what can naturally be used to an extent, the natural boundary of things. But even though it's a lot more like, hey, that looks really humanoid to an extent, you could still tell parts are metal or bulky, and not the weird cloth from here. Not to mention its equipment-wise and just its description is terrifying. Namely because its initial experimentations with this technology, it would just rip metal from biological targets. It still can, but in its general experimentation, a lot of its own, in its descriptions, a lot of its own scientists were saying, this thing is too dangerous, this technology is too dangerous or lethal to keep producing, we should have stopped this. But hey, the company board wanted this, there was demand, and we now have the White Witch, and all the doom that can bring. So now we get into a lot of the alternative frames, which beginning with the Viceroy. So, Viceroy-wise, it's in the same tier as Monarch. It's not less, it's not better, but its whole shtick of hey, this one is the supposed to be smaller scaled, more frontline, more accessible version than the Monarch itself, but it's still that weird delicate balance. Whereas the Monarch is supposed to get longer range targets from a distance, being able to weave missiles through buildings. The whole shtick of still being a missile and bombardier isn't, again, not leaning into the mass bombardment, mass explosives of Harrison Armory to an extent, but instead is the delicate, in the middle of combat, close quarters with missiles. Delicate shoulder pods, one big main rocket launcher to an extent that's holding out, but isn't anywhere near the size or capacity or salvo of the Monarch. But I really like the idea that, lore-wise, it is just a natural development of the Monarch itself trying to fill a different role within the battlefield. And it feels like that. I mean, yes, it's even sharing the license to an extent, but it's the whole main chassis thing that it entirely warps the way you're playing it. It's good. It fits that role well, both in lore and both in mechanics. Nice. I'm not even going to bother pronouncing this one. Stortebecker? Oh no. Leans into the angle of ips-n monopolizing things to an extent, but it still follows the same route as the Rayleigh earlier, or oh no. The Raleigh. So its whole shtick being, I really like it lore-wise just for the angle it fits within, because, okay, so this one's a natural development of the Monarch internally within SSC. The whole thing of ips-n buying out and monopolizing things as well as, hey, another company tries to do their own spin on the Raleigh. Well, company gets bought out, and their own chassis mixed within the Raleigh itself, but similar to, hey, Monarch but different. I mean, it goes for a lot of the different alternative frames, where this is super close quarters combat, this one is trying to be a bit more ranged and messing with, okay, getting different bonuses on crits, or being able to use loading weapons to a different extent, or like load fire, fire load. A lot more of almost a dance, namely because you have to like go back and forth between things with its own different traits. But can be a bit more ranged, can still get into melee a bit, and also still fits that vibe of the lone fighter specialized. But I think B. Like, I like its lore, I think it's doing good things, it's just finicky trait-wise and general theming on, like, what is it supposed to do itself. It says it's more ranged focus than the Raleigh itself, but, you know. Orcus! Oh boy! The Orcus itself is an alternative frame for the Black Witch, and man, this is not the Black Witch you're thinking of. As in, even within the Black Witch's own description, it's used for like, hey, defense on like acting as a private bodyguard for specific nobles in Karrakin space, and having the familiar angle of it, and like what a witch, medieval-esque Black Witch might look like. It's not this. In its own description, the Orcus is a frame that was already a massive frontline, internally developed thing within Karrakin space that, due to cooperation with SSC, can be incorporated with Black Witch components and compatible. This is a main frontline stay within Karrakin forces, at least chassis-wise. This isn't a private, oh, I'm a bodyguard. This is a frontline fighter. But is still really good defensive-wise, namely due to its shield, both in protecting itself and allies next to it. Also, it just looks sick. I mean, look at that thing. All the banners trailing off of it, the whole spear, different heraldic devices on it, the massive spear. Like, it's awesome. Next is the Calendula, which is a horse, alternative for the Minotaur, but again, KTB, so primarily KTB first and foremost, which I love in the lore, brings up that the code base for this, because it's so difficult to actually track or trace what the original origins of it are, potentially existed before the Minotaur was discovered, or not just before that, before KTB made contact with the Union. The code technically existed within that space, related to the weirder religious xenoglossary angle of KTB, but its whole shtick being instead of like, hey, manipulating space-time around people and screwing with people in the maze, we're just gonna rip holes in space-time and purposely shunt ourselves and people into it. Potentially into the firmament that the Onyx space claims to know. Horse-wise, leans into the weird angle of it, it's a lot more similar to the others, the KTB, because again, if we're counting the manufacturer as a thing on it, this is not necessarily SSC heavy. This, however, paracausal tech, weird design, messing with things, different bits of hacking. Also weird, like even though it is still KTB and known within that space, it is part of the weirder fringe elements of KTB. I mean, it still gets all the other components of Minotaur. I'll put it in A. It kept hesitating between C, B, and A. Still really cool. Essentially, it's ripping holes in space. Now we have the Ranger variant of the Swallowtail. So I'm gonna put this in A, above this, because yes, it's used by other people. It's something really pretty local to Hercynia, but can be used and theoretically can be elsewhere. It's a skirmish tank, it's still about the prediction, with alongside the Swallowtail, less cloaking, but its whole shtick being, I'm all about prepping and ambushing. The fact that you can pick traits that are on the battlefield whenever you enter a scenario because you planned ahead for this. You prepared for it. And I love the lore side tab of it, both its use within Hercynia, but also it just leaves the element open of, hey, this is what a customized, localized variant of something can look like. If you don't know this is a Swallowtail on a first glance, outside of, because it's like, okay, a tank with legs, it's got wheel components optionally, but even the tops looks different. Like, so many of its components are changed. It doesn't have the sleek, necessary design of SSC, which ironically is putting it above the Swallowtail. just because it leans into the personalized element of it, but also just the lore-wise, the possibility of what these other chassis can look like, even with something that is a lot more standardized. Though if I am... I haven't organized these sideways, and I don't think I'm going to, but like it could be B, it could be A. I have a soft spot for it because I really like its funky abilities. And it still has the other Swallowtail components. It's just a different type of skirmish. Instead of the cloak and hide and then pin, it's the planning out the battlefield ahead of time, knowing where to ambush. So apologies again for pronunciation, but man, I love this frame. Impake? Lore-wise, the situation set up for it, the way it's built, the whole poet and crazed mech artisan designing it under SSC, and then the cooperation between ips-n and SSC to make this what people even in the setting call this monstrous combination of, this isn't a beautiful thing like we were supposed to see, this is a horrid, monstrous thing, which even in the tab says 50% of the mass is taken up by the arm. It is so flavorful and ridiculously mechanical, and even just in its image. Like I said, I'm a sucker for non-symmetrical things. I love it. I just love it. I love how it's expanding upon stuff with the SSC, OmniNet, ips-n. The potential for the cooperation between those two on different chassis. Because none of these have been a cooperation between the different manufacturers. Some of them the foundries of KTB for sure, but none necessarily between each other. Some rivaling, but this is like, hey, yeah, they work together on a chassis. And it's this wondrous, wondrous monstrosity. I love it. It just ticks so many boxes. And even just mechanically and damage-wise for that arm, you can even use it when jammed. It has its own separate CompCon unit operating just the arm. Like, you're piloting the spec itself over here. The arm's more suggestion. Next up, alternative-wise, the Enkidu. Which I'm putting in A. Because if you ask me, it fits the role the Tokugawa is supposedly filling. Where this is like, it's now described as an officer thing, but it's all mechanically wanting you to blitz forward and get into combat and almost destroy yourself in the process. That is the Enkidu. The Enkidu is that. Like, it is known infamously for killing its pilots. Not even just through destruction or being fragile to an extent. No, the ability to operate it requires drugs and psychoactive substances to be able to use it in its integration and experimentation with stuff on Hercynia. It is the blitz force that is being sent out violently to go deal with something. And the thing it was meant to deal with, luckily it never saw production, or at least full scale, was the citizens of Union under SETCOM. Those that were revolting against it, or this is the monstrous, dangerous to itself and everyone around it blitz force. Which is why it goes into A, because it also ties back into Harrison Armory and its origins tied to SETCOM and its own experimentation tied to it. And the danger to it even plays more into the danger to itself, and not just the hotshot angle, but this guy's not gonna live for long, whoever's piloting it. But hopefully the thing they're fighting is gonna be even shorter. And lastly, World Killer. Also A. It's the Mark I of Genghis. It's tied to Hercynia, it's tied to the origins of Harrison Armory, it's tied to the SETCOM. There's so much lore wrapped up into it. And even some of the initial conflicts between Harrison Armory and the Karrakin trade baronies. It just plays so well into the thing that this is a destructive force of nature. Which is more horrifying because it's not natural. It is a destructive force of industry, of humanity, of xenocide. Like, we joke about, the War Crimes Company, which, yes, but this is, the staple of that. And with that, that is all the chassis and alternative frames that I was going to go over. Namely focusing on how it lines up with the lore, how it lines up with the manufacturer specifically, and also just personal taste and preference into the design and how it kind of all wraps itself together. But yeah, no, it's not mechanics necessarily off to the side of it, but this also definitely went into ramble territory. Which, I mean, that's kind of what you were going to get with this anyway. Talking through everything in a bit more detail than like the 20 seconds it gets on one of the manufacturer videos. But in short, again, I love all of these. I just think, especially judging it just based off like manufacturer lore, how best it supposedly fits into that design-wise, namely visually, or what it can offer, or just cool factor to an extent. Like Toka, if we're doing just cool factor favorites, this whole list would be very different. But just in how well I feel it fits into the niche that its lore sets up, the manufacturer it's under sets up, and its ties into whatever's going on, mixed with a little bit of cool factor and bias. But in any case, I hope you like this. If you have any opinions or think that even under my own judgments that some of these should be moved, mention it in the comments below, or mention what you think is your favorite or some of your favorite lore tidbits from some of these, or their different components in the licenses. Like I said previously, opinions change. Especially after doing a license video for something, I'm usually like way hyped up for it. Even though with the Drake and the Barbarossa, it might not seem like that. I do love these two. I just think under its preferences, lore-wise, its general design, they might be a bit thrown in or not quite fitting what it's trying to go for, at least in every scenario. Because, hey, it's a tier list, I can't put everything in S or A. Some stuff had to be down here. But anywho, thank you for watching this long video. Thank you to my patrons, and have a nice day. You can't see it, but I'm doing the salute.